Hey guys, tonight we're heading into a story so strange, so glittery, and so feathered, you might just start side-eyeing birds forever. You're wandering through a soft Grecian twilight, the air thick with jasmine and the smell of olive oil hanging like a sleepy perfume. The breeze whispers through fig trees, cicadas drone in the distance, and over a quiet lake, gliding gracefully on the surface like he owns it. Which, technically, he kind of does. A swan is drifting toward you with golden eyes and suspicious confidence. That's no ordinary bird. That's Zeus, king of the gods, ruler of the sky, world-class meddler, and apparently part-time waterfowl. Yep, tonight we're talking about why Zeus, omnipotent, thunderbolt-wielding sky daddy, turned into a swan for romance. Or something like romance. Or what passed for romance in ancient Greece. Either way, feathers were involved, and eggs, and a queen, and possibly a very confused husband. You probably won't survive this with your dignity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink, and Zeus the swan spreads his wings, gliding low and smooth above the water. In Greek mythology, this isn't even the weirdest thing he's done, it's just one of the more poetic ones. And more confusing. You've got questions already. Why a swan? Was it symbolic? Was it flattering? Spoiler. No, it was mostly chaotic. The setting is Sparta, in the mythical haze of prehistory. Not the sweaty, hoplite-heavy Sparta you're picturing from movies, but a softer version where gods walk in disguise and queens nap under fig trees. Here lives Leda, a mortal queen known for her beauty, brains, and the unfortunate distinction of catching Zeus's wandering celestial eye. Leda's just chilling. Maybe she's picking flowers. Maybe she's soaking her royal ankles in a stream. Either way, she looks up, and here comes a swan. But not an awkward, honking mess like you'd see at the local pond. This one's gliding like an oil painting come to life. Shimmering, regal, probably glowing slightly. Because of course. Now, to be fair, Zeus didn't just wake up one day and think, you know what would be romantic? Turning into a bird and dropping in uninvited. No, he was escaping someone. Namely, his wife, Hera, queen of Olympus and frequent goddess of justifiably furious wives everywhere. Historians still argue whether the swan form was meant to be romantic camouflage or just divine trolling. One version of the myth says Zeus disguised himself as a swan to hide from Hera's wrath, fluttering dramatically into Leda's arms as if he were the victim of some noble predator. Another version? He just thought the swan thing would work. You know, as a move. Weirdly, this isn't even the first time he used animal forms to get what he wanted. Remember the bull with Europa? The golden rain with Danae? The literal ant with Medusa? Yes, an ant. Well, crawling. Romantic. If you're noticing a pattern of bad choices and shape-shifting, you're not wrong. Zeus was basically the god of questionable decisions with good lighting. So back to Leda. The swan swoops in, and what happens next depends on which ancient poet you ask, and how caffeinated they were. Some say Leda willingly embraced the bird, seeing through the disguise. Others hint at trickery or dreamlike confusion. The myth gets blurry here, like it's been smudged through centuries of poetic retellings and moral edits. But the result? Eggs. That queen lays a couple of massive, divine-tinged eggs. Which, in case you were wondering, is not standard reproductive behavior for Spartan royalty. From these eggs hatch some very recognizable mythological names. Most famously, Helen of Troy, yes, the Helen, and the twins Castor and Pollux, also known as the Dioscuri. One of them mortal, the other immortal. Because why keep it simple? The idea of a woman giving birth to eggs already sounds like something from a Renaissance fever dream, but the Greeks weren't aiming for realism. They were going for symbolism, poetry, and occasional full-blown absurdity. And historians still argue whether this myth was meant to be literal, metaphorical, or just an elaborate excuse to explain why Helen was so impossibly hot. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, you're in Sparta. The Swan has landed. Leda's life just got a lot more mythologically complicated. And the skies above you? Filled with the subtle crackle of divine nonsense, drifting down like warm olive oil. You wander through the fields, picturing this odd little divine romance unfold. Half bird-watching expedition, half ancient rom-com with confusing power dynamics and no therapist in sight. Somewhere in the distance, a lyre twangs gently. Maybe Orpheus is tuning up for a background soundtrack. Maybe it's just the wind through reeds. Either way, you're being lulled into a myth that's been retold, reimagined, and occasionally rewritten by artists who definitely needed sleep and maybe fewer marble statues with dramatic backstories. As you settle into this feathered fiasco, keep this in mind. In Greek mythology, love stories are never just love stories. They're wars in disguise, symbols stacked on metaphors, and sometimes they involve swans who are definitely not swans. And you're along for the glide. So now you're floating just behind Leda, who is understandably dazed by her unexpected avian visitor. One moment she's relaxing in a sun-warmed meadow, maybe humming a tune about olive harvests or hero gossip, and the next, poof, she's embroiled in an interspecies divine affair with cosmic implications. Classic Tuesday. But who even was Leda before Zeus decided to dive-bomb her life in full feathery regalia? Let's rewind a bit. Leda, in most versions, is the daughter of Theseus, a king of Aetolia, which you can picture as the ancient version of a mid-tier kingdom with decent wine and better gossip. She marries Tyndareus, the mortal king of Sparta. Now, this wasn't just a political union. It was a golden ticket to one of the most respected royal families in Greek mythology. And Leda? She holds her own. Beautiful, yes, because that's a job requirement in myth, but also known for being sharp, poised, and mysteriously composed, even when being flirted with by airborne waterfowl. Some say she was already pregnant by her husband Tyndareus when Zeus swooped in, which makes the eggy aftermath even more confusing. Was it one set of eggs? Two? Were the children half and half? Historians still argue whether the twin births were intended to explain conflicting genealogies or just a poetic cop-out. Either way, biology took the night off. It gets wilder. In some versions, Leda lays 2 eggs. One contains Helen and Pollux, the divine twins. The other, Clytemnestra and Castor, the mortal ones. Yes, Clytemnestra, the future queen of shade and stabby revenge, wife of Agamemnon, and not exactly a people-pleaser. And Castor and Pollux? Famous for their bromance, so strong it literally became a constellation. But for now, the eggs are just eggs. Big, gleaming, gently glowing maybe. You imagine Leda wrapping them in embroidered linens and placing them on some kind of royal pillow. Because how do you handle that situation? Honey, I laid 2 eggs today. Tyndareus probably went for a very long walk. Now here's the tricky part. Tyndareus, mortal husband, isn't written off. He stays in the picture, raising the kids like a champ and mostly just pretending the whole Swan incident didn't happen. This is where Greek myth subtly flexes, the divine and the mortal not just colliding, but cohabiting like awkward roommates. Zeus gets to fly off and throw lightning bolts at Titans or whatever, and poor Tyndareus is left naming egg babies. And while we're being honest, Leda doesn't get much say in all this. She appears calm, collected, maybe even accepting. But you get the sense she's had to be like a mythological version of a diplomat who sighs every time the sky rumbles. Her whole identity gets wrapped up in being the mother of famous children. That's it. Which is a shame, because she sounds like someone who could have handled politics, battle, or maybe a nice vineyard had the gods left her alone. Let's pause on a lighter note, literally. You ever heard of the Leda and the Swan sonnet by W.B. Yeats? It's intense, romantic, eerie, and weirdly hypnotic. It's one of the many reimaginings of this myth across centuries. Artists, poets, and painters keep coming back to this one image, a swan and a woman, tangled in symbolism and silk. The Renaissance especially loved it, because what's more artistically tantalizing than divine bird flirtation? There's even a fringe theory, deep in academic backrooms and occasionally wine-fueled late-night debates, that Leda didn't really exist as a person, but as a mythic vessel to explain divine lineage. Like a placeholder mom for God-touched kids. But that's cold. So for our journey, she's real. She's thoughtful. And she probably regrets walking near that lake. Meanwhile, back in Mythland, you stroll past the royal nursery and imagine these eggs quietly rocking like oversized Faberge time bombs. No one knows when they'll hatch. You picture Spartan midwives trying not to scream. Maybe even keeping the whole thing a secret from nosy palace staff. And here's a quirky tidbit. Ancient Greek medicine believed women could birth all sorts of weird things depending on their dreams, moods, or diet. Stones, rabbits, even full-grown insects. So eggs? Not totally off-brand. But not unthinkable in a world where oracles decide state policy and gods crash weddings disguised as clouds. But the implications of Leda's story don't stop with eggs. Oh no, they ripple out through history, across generations. Because these children aren't just mythological footnotes, they become the cornerstones of epic tales, tragic wars, and constellations. Helen, the future queen of Oops, I Started the Trojan War. Castor and Pollux, the inseparable twins who symbolize brotherhood, bravery, and the zodiac sign Gemini. And Clytemnestra, whose knife skills would one day make headlines. And all of that? Hatched from one very questionable encounter under the guise of bird romance. You picture Leda now, cradling an egg, whispering lullabies, not knowing what kind of future sleeps inside. She doesn't know her daughter will spark a war that levels cities. She doesn't know her sons will become stars. She's just doing her best with what she's been given, which, to be fair, is a deeply confusing parenting situation. The palace around her feels timeless. Pillars catch the amber light of sunset. Olive branches rustle. Somewhere nearby, the swan, maybe no longer a swan, has vanished back into Olympus, leaving behind a trail of shimmering feathers and dramatic consequences. And you're already drifting deeper into the myth, curled on a cushion beside Leda's throne, waiting for those eggs to crack open and the story to truly begin. You don't have to wait long. One by one, those eggs begin to tremble. Not violently, more like a soft twitch, a subtle hiccup in the silk folds they rest on. You picture the royal attendants silently freaking out, unsure whether to grab a sword, a spoon, or just start praying to whatever god didn't turn into poultry. Then comes the crack, sharp, delicate, almost like the sound of splitting ice. And just like that, Leda's children emerge, not gooey and fragile like real hatchlings, but practically pre-bundled in divine glow. No diapers needed. No baby cries. Just otherworldly cooing and suspiciously symmetrical cheekbones. First out, Helen and Pollux, their skin touched with the kind of radiance that makes you blink twice. From the start, you know they're not quite normal. Helen's eyes are the color of sunlit marble. Pollux is already flexing like a toddler who knows he'll wrestle mythic beasts one day. These two? Clearly Zeus's work. Next come Clytemnestra and Castor, a little less radiant but just as mesmerizing. Clytemnestra arrives with this quiet, watchful gaze like she's already planning her life's vengeance arc. Castor giggles and promptly tries to headbutt his twin. Sibling balance. And just like that, Sparta has quadruplets, two divine, two mortal, one massive PR problem. You imagine the royal advisors in the back, nervously drafting birth announcements. Rejoice! The queen has delivered eggs. Healthy ones. Please don't ask questions. Now, the timeline here gets fuzzy because Greek myth doesn't really believe in logic. Scholars still argue whether these twins were born at the same time or across staggered myth cycles. Were Castor and Pollux always meant to be opposite halves of the same heroic coin? Or did ancient poets just mash together stories like a mythological remix? Either way, they grow fast, like time-lapse montage fast. Within what feels like a few seasons, the twins are training with Spartan warriors, leaping over spears and trading epic smack talk. Helen, meanwhile, is already turning heads before she's even hit full royalty. One local shepherd reportedly renounces his herd just to stare at her for 3 days straight. Not healthy, but definitely on brand. And you? You wander through their childhood like an invisible guest at the most intense family reunion ever. You sit beside Leda in the shade of the palace garden while she watches her strange, glorious children chase each other with wooden swords. You feel the weight of prophecy starting to wrap around them like ivy. The kind that doesn't let go. Because here's the thing. These four will tear through Greek mythology like a trail of divine glitter and mild destruction. And it all loops back to Zeus's Swan moment. Let's zoom in on Helen for a moment. Even as a child, her beauty causes diplomatic incidents. There's a story, yes, this is real, about her getting kidnapped by Theseus before she hits her teens. You remember Theseus, the guy who killed the Minotaur and had a mild addiction to getting lost in labyrinths. Well, apparently even he couldn't resist taking Helen for a joyride. Spoiler, it doesn't go well. She gets rescued, and Theseus gets deeply embarrassed. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Some sources say Helen never aged normally. Like, she was born adult-shaped, and her beauty was so intense it could shatter mirrors or give men spontaneous poetry syndrome. Historians still argue whether her image was shaped by real cults worshipping her like a goddess, or just centuries of people being really bad at subtlety. Meanwhile, Castor and Pollux are becoming the action heroes of the Bronze Age. Think synchronized battle sequences, horse taming, and saving their sister from awkward suitors. Pollux is the immortal one, being a full Zeus kid. Castor's mortal, so naturally, there's a ticking clock on their epic bromance. But that doesn't stop them from joining up with Jason and the Argonauts on that wild quest for the Golden Fleece. You know, because why just stay home and rule Sparta when you can sail with a bunch of shirtless demigods and fight harpies? Clytemnestra, though? She keeps a low profile for now. Quiet, observant, and already calculating. She's the kind of character who reads the room, memorizes everyone's weaknesses, and files it away for later. You can almost feel the foreshadowing whispering around her like wind through temple columns. It's here, drifting through these growing years, that the story starts to split into threads. Helen's beauty becomes a geopolitical weapon. Castor and Pollux become folk heroes. Clytemnestra waits in the shadows, sharpening invisible knives. And at the heart of it all is Leda, watching her swan-born children step into history, knowing that none of them were meant for quiet lives. And Zeus? Nowhere to be found. Typical. You lie back in the royal orchard, where the olive trees glow silver in the moonlight. Overhead, maybe, you can't be sure, two faint stars twinkle in perfect sync. Gemini, the legacy of the twins. The myth says Pollux gave up half his immortality when Castor died, so they could live in the heavens together. A celestial twin bunk bed, if you will. And the best part? Every time someone reads their story, or stargazes from a quiet rooftop, those twins come alive again. You're part of that cycle now, following their path, step by mythic step. It's strange to think all of this, the abductions, the constellations, the Trojan War detour, starts with a quiet ripple in a pond, a startled queen, and a deeply suspicious swan. But that's Greek mythology for you. One divine impulse, and suddenly everyone's writing epic poetry and launching ships. The garden fades. A warm breeze replaces the smell of ripening figs. You're swept along again. No need to pack your bags or rent a chariot, because time and myth never moves in a straight line. One moment you're watching Helen braid her hair with gold thread, and the next, you're walking beside her as the most eligible men in Greece line up outside her palace doors like it's Olympus idol. You'd think there would be a little more chill in choosing a husband, but no. This is Helen. And the phrase, face that launched 1,000 ships, isn't just poetic, it's a warning label. Everyone wants her. Kings, princes, demigods. Probably even a sea monster or two. It's chaos wrapped in togas. Her father figure, Tyndareus, that ever-patient Spartan king, is overwhelmed. Because choosing one suitor means angering all the others. Imagine offending every warlord with a sword collection and fragile ego. That's a one-way ticket, toops. My palace caught fire. Here comes the quirky twist. To avoid bloodshed, Odysseus, yes, that Odysseus, suggests a clever solution. Every suitor must swear an oath. Whoever wins Helen's hand, the rest must defend the marriage, no matter what. The "I solemnly swear not to throw a tantrum" clause. The works, for now. Helen chooses Menelaus, brother to Agamemnon. He's fine. Solid beard. Respectable throne. Not exactly fireworks, but stable. You can't help but feel a little underwhelmed on Helen's behalf. Zeus turns into a bird for her birth, and she ends up with a man who thinks fine Corinthian columns is a romantic gift. Historians still argue whether Helen truly had a choice in this match or if politics did the matchmaking. Some even suggest she loved someone else all along. But here's where things start curdling like bad goat milk. Enter Paris of Troy. Paris. Prince. Soft curls. Tunic probably open just enough to imply gym dedication. He's got charm, he's got prophecy trauma, and he's got a golden apple from a goddess beauty contest that literally broke the heavens. Let's rewind just a little, because no tale of Helen in Paris is complete without the judgment of Paris. It's the original Greek reality show. Three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, ask Paris to choose who's the fairest. A divine bribe-off, basically. Hera offers power. Athena offers wisdom and military success. Aphrodite? She promises him the love of the most beautiful woman alive. Cue the apple. Cue the terrible decision. Paris chooses Aphrodite. And now, according to mythology, Helen is his prize. Never mind that she's married. Never mind that this entire situation screams, do not engage. Paris shows up in Sparta like it's casual tourist season, and Helen, either through divine influence, suppressed longing, or just really bad judgment, goes with him. Some say she was enchanted. Others whisper she was bored. Scholars still argue whether Helen was kidnapped or complicit, victim or vixen. One fringe theory? That Helen never even went to Troy. Some say she was spirited away to Egypt, and a phantom Helen took her place. A divine decoy. It's like saying, the war was for a ghost, which is delightfully unhelpful but very Greek. Either way, Menelaus wakes up to an empty throne and no queen. And remember that oath? Yeah, time to cash that in. The suitors, all those guys who promised to defend the marriage, are summoned like Avengers with slightly more tunics. Agamemnon, Menelaus's older brother and resident hothead, seizes the opportunity. War is declared. Not just a skirmish. The war. Ships are built. Armor polished. Prophecies ignored at great peril. And in the midst of this storm stands Helen, whose face has somehow become an international incident. She's no longer just a woman. She's a symbol. An excuse. A spark that lit kindling already piled high by pride, politics, and wounded masculinity. Meanwhile, you drift among the Trojans. The city is a marvel, towers of marble, echoes of ancient music. Helen walks its halls now, a stranger in a gilded cage. Some Trojans adore her. Others blame her for the storm at their gates. And Paris? He gets moodier by the day, caught between divine promises and the very mortal consequences of his decisions. One quiet night, as you float past the palace courtyard, you hear Helen speaking softly to herself. Not poetry, not regret, something stranger, a question. Would they have still come, she whispers, if I'd looked different? And you wonder too, how much of this war is really about her? And how much is the universe flexing its myth muscles, shaking mortals like dice in a bronze-plated cup? Meanwhile, across the sea, armies are gathering like thunderclouds. Achilles sharpens his spear. Odysseus mutters strategies between naps. Even gods are picking sides. Hera's still furious about the apple. Athena's spoiling for a fight. Aphrodite hums lullabies to Paris like a dangerously beautiful sleep playlist. And Zeus? Oh, he's watching from Olympus, smug and silent, probably sipping nectar and pretending to be surprised. The Swan act? That was just the start. He set this divine domino trail in motion, and now the pieces are toppling in perfect rhythm. You settle into the warmth of a campfire on the beach. Somewhere, a soldier sings a low lullaby to the sea. Another sharpens his blade while staring at the stars. All of them wait for dawn and the war it brings. You remember that egg. that ridiculous, world-breaking egg. And you start to understand that nothing in this myth is accidental. Every shimmer of wing, every whispered vow, every choice made under moonlight, it's all part of the grand spiral. And you're spiraling right along with it. Morning breaks over the Aegean in a sweep of honey-colored light, and you're still drifting, now across a restless sea where 1,000 ships bob on the tide like toy boats in a giant's bathtub. The Greeks have launched their grand expedition, sails full and tempers fuller, all in pursuit of one thing, the return of Helen. Or at least, that's the excuse scribbled on the official scrolls. You know by now it's never just about the woman. It's the gods playing Risk on Olympus. It's brothers trying to out-king each other. It's warriors chasing immortal names in history books they can't read because, well, most of them are illiterate. You sidle up to Agamemnon, supreme commander of this chaos parade. He's brooding, naturally. His crown's a bit crooked, his armor polished to a gleam that screams, "I don't do my own laundry." He's got power, no doubt, but the ego of a man who thinks sacrificing his daughter might improve his Wi-Fi signal. Which he actually does. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many scholars believe the Trojan War was inspired by real tensions between Mycenaean Greece and the rich trading city of Walusa, possibly Troy, in Anatolia. Think less Swan transformations and more, we want your harbor. But Agamemnon? He's less worried about trade routes and more about Artemis. The goddess is ticked off. Some say because he killed one of her sacred deer, others because he bragged too much about his hunting skills. The gods are basically mythic Yelp reviewers. 1 star would not bless again. To appease her and get the winds blowing, Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia. Or tries to. Fringe versions say Artemis swaps her for a deer at the last second and spirits the girl away. Historians still argue whether this tale was propaganda to justify brutal leadership or a poetic device meant to humble kings. You, meanwhile, are trying not to gag at the stench of burning offerings as the winds finally rise. The fleet sets sail, bronze gleaming, warriors shouting. Achilles, the golden boy with rage issues and a tendon problem, leads the pack. He's not just any fighter, he's half immortal. His mother dipped him in the river Styx, except for that pesky heel. Classic parental oversight. Odysseus, clever and sleepy-eyed, didn't want to come. He even faked madness by plowing his fields with salt. But the Greeks sniffed him out, and now he's sulking at the back of the armada, already planning 10 different ways to get back home early. You catch glimpses of their tents as the ships reach the shores of Troy. They don't storm the city immediately. That would be efficient, and this is mythology. We need years of sand, drama, and tantrums first. So they dig in. Campfires light the coast. Tensions simmer like a cauldron of week-old stew. The Trojans? They're bracing. Paris poses dramatically on the battlements, still somehow surprised that stealing a queen might cause problems. His brother Hector, however, is the real deal. A warrior. A prince. A family man who probably kisses his kid on the forehead before skewering Greek champions. Hector doesn't want this war, but he'll fight anyway. Meanwhile, Helen walks the palace corridors, her steps echoing. In some retellings, she regrets everything. In others, she defends her love. One thing's clear, her presence turns the city into a powder keg. A quirky tidbit for you. The Greeks brought along a guy named Protesilaus, who, according to a prophecy, would be the first to die. Poor man jumps off the ship, touches Trojan soil, and promptly eats a spear sandwich. Some say his ghost was later seen weeping on the shore. Romance and curses go hand in hand in Greek myth. And somewhere, Zeus watches. Still smug. Because here's the thing, the gods aren't just watching. They're choosing sides. Athena throws her shield behind the Greeks, partly because she's still bitter about losing that beauty contest. Hera too, she's got a long memory and a longer grudge. Aphrodite sticks with Troy, because she's got a PR deal with Paris now. The battlefield is no longer just mortal. It's divine real estate. Each sword clash has celestial stakes. And you, dear listener, are caught in the crossfire of myth. The first few battles blur together like dream sequences. Spears clatter. Chariots squeal. Heroes shout their names mid-strike like it's a mandatory branding exercise. You watch Ajax the Great hurl boulders like dodgeballs. You watch Diomedes wound a god. Yes, an actual god, with such casual violence you wonder if he skipped nap time. Then there's the night raids, quiet and vicious. Odysseus and Diomedes sneak into enemy camps, steal horses, assassinate scouts. It's less glorious war and more espionage with insomnia. Historians still argue whether these stealth missions reflect actual military tactics of the late Bronze Age or are just poetic license taken to the extreme. In the quiet spaces between battles, strange things bloom. A soldier carves Helen's face into his shield, even though he's never seen her. Another prays to Zeus for victory and then immediately trips over his own sandal. One even claims he saw the Swan again, gliding above the battlefield, its wings whispering omens no one understands. You lie beside a riverbank that's turned pink from blood. And you think, all this for a woman who maybe didn't want to leave. Or maybe did. Or maybe was a pawn in a much bigger, much messier game. The wind picks up again. Somewhere, a harp plays a Trojan lullaby. And you? You're still floating. Watching. Waiting. The gods aren't done. And neither is the war. You rub your eyes not because you're tired, though you definitely are, but because it's getting harder to tell what's real and what's mythological PR. The Trojan War rolls on like a drama series no one knows how to end. And in this episode, you find yourself lingering just outside a Greek tent, the one that smells faintly of burnt goat and male ego. This is Achilles' tent. Inside, the mighty warrior with the golden hair and the mood of a thunderstorm is sulking. Not just sulking, actually, he's having a full-blown existential tantrum. Because Agamemnon, whose hobby is alienating his best fighters, decided to take Briseis, Achilles' war prize/sort of girlfriend, for himself. Not a great move when your top warrior already has mommy issues and a divine complex. You watch Achilles glare into the distance like a 14-year-old who just got grounded. He refuses to fight. Just flat out sits down in the sand, arms crossed, brooding so hard the sun feels awkward. His best friend, or, depending on who you ask, maybe more than a friend, Patroclus tries to console him, but Achilles is having none of it. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The epic feud between Achilles and Agamemnon is a core part of Homer's Iliad, an oral tradition that eventually became a literary touchstone of Western civilization. It may or may not be based on a real war, but the characters, flawed, proud, and vividly human, have echoed through time. Now, for your quirky tidbit, Homer never actually says that Patroclus and Achilles were lovers, but the way Achilles reacts later, well, let's just say if someone stole your roommate's armor and got themselves killed, you'd be upset, sure. But this is ancient Greek-level drama. The kind where you weep, smear dirt on your face, and vow divine vengeance. Historians still argue whether Achilles' fury is about lost honor, lost love, or just a bruised male ego. Maybe it's all three. Myth doesn't like tidy answers. Meanwhile, the battlefield doesn't pause for boyish grudges. Without Achilles, the Greeks begin to falter. The Trojans, led by Hector, start pushing back. They're smart, ruthless, and, let's be honest, probably sick of having a beachfront Greek tailgate party outside their walls for nearly a decade. One day, in a moment that feels stitched together with strings of fate, Patroclus can't take it anymore. He begs Achilles to let him wear his armor, to inspire the Greeks, to turn the tide, to pretend the golden warrior has returned. Achilles agrees, reluctantly. Maybe he senses what's coming. Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe that's worse. So Patroclus charges into battle, the armor of Achilles flashing like lightning in the sun. The Greeks rally. The Trojans panic. It works. Until it doesn't. Because Hector sees him. And Hector, thinking this is the real Achilles, does what any prince defending his home would do. He kills him. Spears him, strips the armor, leaves the body behind like a warning. Back in the Greek camp, a silence falls like a dropped curtain. Achilles learns of Patroclus' death and something inside him snaps. You can almost hear it. Not a loud crack, but a subtle tear, like fabric slowly coming apart. Grief wraps around him like a shroud. And with it comes the rage. Achilles returns to battle, not for glory, not for strategy, just for revenge. His wrath is apocalyptic. He slaughters Trojans by the dozens, the sand turning sticky beneath his feet. When he finds Hector, it's not a duel, it's an execution. The Prince of Troy fights valiantly, but Achilles is beyond mercy now. He kills Hector. And then he does something the poets can't quite agree on. He ties the body to his chariot and drags it around the city walls. And again, an act of grief? Spite? Madness? Historians still argue whether this barbaric display was meant to shock ancient audiences or reflect a deeper truth about trauma and vengeance in wartime. Eventually, the gods intervene, because even they have lines. Zeus sends Hermes to guide Hector's father, King Priam, into the Greek camp. And there, in a tent filled with the scent of sweat and sorrow, the old king kneels before Achilles, kisses his hands, and begs for the body of his son. And Achilles weeps. For his enemy, for himself, for all the things he's lost. You lie in the grass outside, listening to that ancient sound, grief not as a scream, but as a whisper. A hollow wind that carries across generations. In the lull that follows, other heroes rise and fall. Ajax the Greater, massive, fearless, practically a tank, goes mad when he's denied Achilles' armor. Some say he slaughters a herd of sheep, thinking they're his enemies. Others say he falls on his own sword from shame. The armor, of course, goes to Odysseus. Because when you're clever and can string a sentence and a bow, you tend to win prizes. Even if you're not the flashiest. Back in Troy, Helen drifts through the palace, her beauty now worn like a burden. Some say she blames herself. Others say she simply waits for fate to finish what it started. And Paris? He's still there, still smiling faintly. But even he must know now that his love has cost more than any heart can hold. A fringe tale slips into your ear as you drift, one that claims the gods, weary of the war, are crafting a plan. Something deceptive, something wooden. But that's not for tonight. Tonight, you linger with the fallen, with the grief-soaked silence, with the sound of waves lapping against shields. The sand beneath you is cool now, washed clean of the day's heat, though not its memory. And somewhere in the dark, a swan cries out across the sky. You wake, or rather, you shift from the muted silence of grief into the slow, creeping rhythm of a city waiting to die. Troy, ever proud, ever doomed, still stands. But the cracks have started to show, and not just in the walls. Inside the city, the mood is shifting from brave to brittle. The Trojans have begun whispering about omens, birds flying the wrong direction, strange dreams, gods that no longer answer prayers. You wander past market stalls half-stocked, children who no longer play pretend war, and soldiers glancing more often at the horizon than at their weapons. Something's coming. Everyone feels it, even if they can't name it. Then one day, the Greeks vanish. You blink. The entire camp is gone. Tents, ships, soldiers, like they never existed. All that remains is a giant wooden statue just outside the city walls. It's a horse. A massive, beautiful, unnecessary horse. And in that moment, every Trojan becomes a philosopher. Some call it a gift to the gods. Others mutter about Greek trickery. One man, Laocoon, practically screams it. He stands before the statue, beard wild, eyes bugging out like he's had one too many prophetic dreams, and shouts the ancient version of, "This is a scam." Laocoon even throws a spear into the side of the horse. It thuds hollow. If the gods had a sense of irony, they'd have ended the story there. But no, they upped the drama. Because right then, 2 sea serpents slither out of the water and strangle Laocoon and his sons in front of everyone. That quirky detail? These serpents, sent by Athena, allegedly, make a compelling case for shutting up and accepting mysterious gifts. Historians still argue whether the horse was real, symbolic, or some clever allegory that Homer later wodifed for drama. Some say it was siege technology, a battering ram disguised in carpentry. Others believe it never existed at all. But hey, it's not bedtime history unless reality is a little suspicious. So, the Trojans wheel the horse into the city. That takes hours. No one stops to ask why the horse is big enough to fit a whole rock band plus backup dancers. They just tug it in like it's a parade float, throw a party, and finally, sleep like the war is over. Spoiler, it's not. You crouch quietly by the walls as night settles. Torchlight flickers. Wine spills on marble. Laughter echoes. Then the trapdoor opens. Greek warriors, led by Odysseus because of course, slide out of the horse like nightmares. Silent, swift, and really sore from being crammed into a wooden sculpture all day. They open the gates. The Greek army, hiding just offshore, rushes in. The city burns. Troy's final hours are chaos. You try to follow Helen, who wanders the palace like a ghost in silk. Some say she helps the Greeks find targets. Others claim she hides, heartbroken. Either way, she survives. That much we know. Paris, unfortunately, does not. An arrow, a corner, a final breath. Priam, the old king, dignified even in collapse, is murdered at the altar of Zeus by Achilles' son, Neoptolemus. Poetic? Maybe. Horrific? Absolutely. You cover your eyes, but the sounds stay. The Greeks show little mercy. It's a night of blood and bronze, of looted temples and broken statues. Troy, once the pride of Asia Minor, becomes ruins in the span of hours. A curious side note, Aeneas, cousin to Hector, escapes with his father and son. He'll wander for years, carrying the ashes of Troy in his memories. Eventually, if Roman poets have their say, his descendants will found Rome. That's right. According to one story, Rome is built by the losers of Troy. Talk about a plot twist. Historians still argue whether the fall of Troy corresponds to real archaeological destruction layers found in Hisarlik, the site most scholars associate with ancient Troy. There are ruins, sure. Burn layers, even. But linking them definitively to Homer's timeline? That's the historian's equivalent of catching a ghost with a butterfly net. As dawn rises, smoke curling like prayers into the sky, the Greek victors begin to sail home. Except, of course, nothing goes smoothly in myth. You squint at the coastline. Storm clouds gather like a vengeful curtain, because the gods, petty as ever, are not pleased. Especially Athena, and especially Poseidon, who's furious that the Greeks defiled his temples. He whips up storms, sends monsters, ruins homecomings. Honestly, if this were a travel agency, it'd get 0 stars. Odysseus, in particular, is about to have the worst commute in history. But that's a tale for another night. Tonight, your sandals crunch through the ashes of a city that once glowed with pride. You step over shattered amphorae, broken lyres, and a doll left behind in the rush. A soft breeze blows, but it carries no comfort. You pass a wall, scorched but standing. A mural of gods once painted there is now charred into shadows. You pause, tracing the shape of Zeus, throned, proud, distant. Still a swan in your memory. You wonder if he mourns. If the gods ever weep for what their meddling leaves behind. Probably not. But you do. Because even in the quiet, even as sleep tugs at your limbs, you know, Troy has fallen, but its echoes will last forever. You don't move for a while. Just stand there in the smoky stillness, watching the sea swallow the last of the Greek ships. Their sails catch the wind like whispered promises, some heading home, others toward disaster. And all around you, the ruins of Troy settle into silence. But the story? Oh, it's far from over. Because now, you follow the strangest of threads, the fates of those who won. Funny how winning in mythology usually comes with a hefty curse tax. You trail behind Agamemnon, proud and brooding, as he sails toward Mycenae. He's got Cassandra with him now. Yes, the Trojan priestess cursed to speak the truth but never be believed. She's muttering prophecies no one listens to, because of course she is. That's her whole thing. She tells him not to trust home, not to trust the palace. But Agamemnon, fresh from victory and high on hubris, shrugs her off like a bad Yelp review. Spoiler, she's right. Agamemnon steps into a royal welcome prepared by his wife, Clytemnestra, who has spent the last 10 years simmering like a revenge stew. See, before sailing to Troy, Agamemnon sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia to get favorable winds. Which, if you're keeping score, is pretty high on the list of things not to do in a marriage. So when he returns home, Cassandra in tow, Clytemnestra greets him with silk robes, a warm bath, and a knife. She kills him. Right there. In the tub. No dramatic duel, no long speech. Just betrayal, swift and final. Cassandra too. No one believes her until it's far too late. Historians still argue whether this revenge motif reflects real dynastic struggles in Mycenaean Greece, or if it's all poetic metaphor for how power corrupts and households implode. But the image of a queen waiting with blood in her heart? That's pure theater. Meanwhile, you drift across the sea, gliding gently toward another survivor of Troy's fall, Helen. She's back in Sparta now, lounging like the war never happened. Menelaus, her husband, welcomes her with weary affection. The people are divided. Some whisper betrayal, others sigh with relief. Helen simply smiles, perfect as ever, as if the deaths of thousands were just a particularly aggressive vacation. Quirky twist? Some versions of the myth say the real Helen was never in Troy at all. That Zeus, or maybe the gods, created a phantom Helen, a cloud-shaped decoy, and the Greeks fought for nothing. Literal smoke and mirrors. If true, that makes the entire war the most expensive misunderstanding in history. Still, Helen lives. Which is more than can be said for almost everyone else. But you're not done floating through the wreckage of myth just yet. Because now you're tracing the restless feet of Odysseus, who, surprise, hasn't made it home either. In fact, he's just beginning what will become the Odyssey, the ultimate detour. You stand at the edge of his ship, watching the sky darken. He's offended Poseidon, which is like offending your Uber driver mid-trip and expecting a smooth ride. Storms hit. Monsters emerge. His crew shrinks faster than your attention span during a 3-hour museum tour. But Odysseus presses on. He's stubborn, clever, also a little cursed. At one stop, he meets the Lotus Eaters, who offer flowers that erase memory. One bite and you forget your goals, your past, even your name. It's basically ancient Greek Netflix. He drags his crew away before they can binge. Then there's the Cyclops, Polyphemus, a giant with a penchant for human snacks. Odysseus blinds him with a sharp stick and the world's most confusing alias, Nobody. When the Cyclops screams for help, saying, "Nobody is hurting me," his neighbors ignore him. Classic prank. Classic trauma. Historians still argue whether these stories stem from sailor tales twisted over centuries, or metaphors for real encounters with foreign lands and strange customs. Either way, you're now dodging whirlpools and sirens and accidentally killing sacred cows. You sigh. Being a mythic hero is exhausting. Eventually, Odysseus reaches Circe, a sorceress who turns men into pigs. But he resists, mostly. They spend a year together, a soft pause in the madness, before he's back on the sea, heading reluctantly home. And then there's the underworld. He visits the land of the dead, where ghostly figures drift in shadow, whispering prophecies and regrets. Achilles, now a shade, admits he'd rather be a living nobody than a dead hero. It's a chilling moment. Even in myth, glory fades. You shiver, the air colder here. You step lightly as if not to wake the bones. Eventually, after many more detours, including the deadly Scylla and Charybdis, and the island of the sun god, Odysseus loses every crew member and washes up on the shores of Ithaca. Alone, older, unrecognizable. But he's not done. He disguises himself as a beggar. He strings a bow only he can wield. He defeats the suitors who've been loitering in his home, drinking his wine, eyeing his wife. Penelope, clever as ever, recognizes him not by sight, but by their bed, a secret only they know. It's built from the trunk of a living olive tree. That detail, of all things, breaks you. Because in the midst of so much death and deception, here is something rooted. Something real. Something that hasn't burned. You close your eyes. The sea laps gently. The ruins fade. But the stories? The stories stay. You keep drifting, like a feather on mythic wind, right into the most absurd transformation tale in all of Olympus. A story so baffling you start questioning whether ancient gods ever had a concept of boundaries. Now, you find yourself perched on the branch of a silent, swan-filled lake. There's no modern sound here, no car horns, no podcasts, just the hush of feathers and the slow glide of white across water. It's romantic, peaceful, weirdly ominous. Because tonight, Zeus is about to make his most infamous move. You watch him shimmer into the world, not as a thunder-wielding king, but as a full-on swan. Elegant neck, impossibly white plumage. And those eyes? Still somehow smirking. You have to ask yourself, why a swan? Historians still argue whether this choice had symbolic weight, purity, grace, divine disguise, or if Zeus was just feeling extra that day. Either way, it's happening. And the target? A mortal woman named Leda. Now, Leda's no minor character. She's the queen of Sparta, married to King Tyndareus, and according to later legends, the future mother of Helen. Yes, that Helen. And here comes Zeus, swanning around like he owns the pond, which he kind of does. The myths differ. Some say he seduced her gently, others paint it as far darker. The Greeks weren't exactly consistent about consent in their storytelling, which makes things murky and morally uncomfortable. You squint, unsure what version this dreamscape is pulling from. But either way, the result is the same. Leda ends up laying eggs. Literal, giant eggs. You stare in disbelief as one cracks open to reveal Helen, glowing like sunlight on marble. Another hatches the twins Castor and Pollux, and maybe even Clytemnestra, depending on which poet you ask. Yes, you're still in a story where mortals can lay eggs, and nobody thinks it's weird enough to stop and ask follow-up questions. Swans in ancient Greece weren't just birds. They were tied to poetry, music, prophecy. Apollo had swans. Orpheus had swans. They were symbols of beauty, but also transformation. So maybe Zeus was trying to be poetic. Maybe. Or maybe he just got bored of being a bull, an eagle, a shower of gold, and thought, time for feathers. You shake your head. Quirky side note? In the Renaissance, artists adored this myth. They painted Leda and the swan like it was the height of tragic romance. Soft curves, flowing water, draped fabric. But beneath the aesthetics lies a myth that's honestly, deeply strange. And scholars? Oh, they argue fiercely. Was this tale meant as allegory for divine inspiration invading human lives? Was it political propaganda for ruling families tracing their line back to gods? Or was it just ancient fanfic gone rogue? You lean back into the breeze, watching Leda disappear behind the reeds. Somewhere in Sparta, her swan babies are growing up to trigger wars and rewrite history. No big deal. You turn your gaze north, past the olive groves, toward the rocky crags of Delphi. Because if we're going to talk about divine weirdness, we can't skip Apollo, god of the sun, music, and increasingly awkward mortal affairs. He had a thing for chasing mortals too, though unlike Zeus, he often got nothing but heartbreak in return. Take Daphne, a mountain nymph. Apollo falls for her after getting smacked by Cupid's love arrow, a divine prank, really, and chases her through the woods like a god with zero chill. Daphne prays for help, and just before Apollo catches her, she transforms into a laurel tree. A literal tree. Apollo stands there panting, his arms full of branches. But he's not angry. No, he's poetic. He declares the laurel his sacred tree. Wreaths made from it will crown poets and champions forever. Romantic? Maybe. A bit obsessive? Also yes. The transformation theme repeats everywhere. In Greek mythology, becoming something else, bird, tree, star, is often the only escape from divine pursuit. You either become divine or get absorbed by it. You look up at the night sky, tracing constellations named for former mortals. Callisto, a bear now frozen in Ursa Major. Orion, still hunting in the dark. Zeus, Apollo, Artemis, they all leave trails behind them, bodies turned into symbols. And it always starts the same way, a mortal caught in the gravitational pull of gods. Back at the lake, the swans are gliding quietly, as if nothing ever happened. One dips its beak beneath the surface. Another flutters its wings with regal calm. It's almost soothing. Almost. You blink, and suddenly you're standing beside a marble statue of Zeus, towering and severe, his expression unreadable. It's the Zeus people prayed to in temples, not the one turning into barnyard animals for date night. This version radiates power, but not charm. And it makes you wonder, how did mortals reconcile this figure of law and thunder with the stories of swan tricks and golden rain? The Greeks compartmentalized. Gods were complex, capable of justice, cruelty, inspiration, and chaos. They weren't role models. They were explanations. A way to understand the messiness of life. You exhale slowly. That's the trick with these myths. They're beautiful, disturbing, and deeply human, even when they're packed with immortals and eggs. They weren't meant to comfort. They were meant to mirror. And sometimes that mirror has feathers. You watch a single swan take flight, wings beating slow and deep across the moonlit water. Its shadow stretches over you, long and graceful and impossible. And for a moment, just a moment, you wonder what it would be like to become something else. To float above it all. To leave the war, the heartbreak, the gods, and the eggs behind. You ease away from the swan-splashed lake and drift back into the marble-lit corridors of myth's grand palace, where stories of gods, mortals, consent, and consequence swirl like incense smoke. Tonight, you're about to confront the question no one dared whisper back in the glory days of Olympus. What does consent mean when a god can turn into anything, even the very thing you admire? You find yourself in a quiet chamber where half-remembered tales hang on stone walls like dusty tapestries. Here, the night hush is punctuated only by distant strains of a lyre, Apollo's, though whether he's composing a lullaby or a vengeance hymn, you can't quite tell. You settle onto a cushioned bench, mind swirling as you try to untangle mortal agency from immortal impulse. It starts with Zeus, once a handsome man, then a golden rain, now a swan. You recall how Leda had almost no choice when she met that swan. She's not the only one. The annals of Olympus overflow with stories of mortals swept up in divine disguises. Europa, lured by a bull, Danae, showered in gold, Alcmene, tricked by phantom Zeus into thinking he was her husband for a night. It's a litany of questions. Were they enchanted? Did they resist? Was there any real yes in these encounters, or just stunned compliance as lightning bolts flickered behind their eyes? Here's a mainstream historical fact. Ancient Greeks didn't frame their myths with the word consent the way modern societies do. Instead, they talked about seduction, persuasion, sometimes outright force, often cloaked in poetic language and divine prerogative. Mortal perspectives rarely mattered because gods were gods. If Zeus wanted you, he got you. Historians still argue whether this divine license was a reflection of ancient power dynamics or simply a literary device that Thracian bards used to spice up bedtime stories. You shift on the cushion, tracing the pattern of a marble column, spirals that remind you of a coiled serpent, sinuous and unstoppable. You remember Europa, carried away by the bull that was Zeus. The story frames her as a willing companion, charmed by that gentle bovine gaze. But scratch beneath the surface, and you find versions hinting at abduction, her father distraught, her sisters searching for her in vain. Was she taken or seduced? It depends on which poet you ask, and how generous their quill felt that day. A fringe tidbit floats into your thoughts. Some vase paintings depict Pasiphae, mother of the Minotaur, not as a victim but as complicit in her own transformation of desire, courting a bull because Zeus's whim was also the whim of fate. Scholars still argue whether such representations were symbolic critiques of divine overreach or commentary on human complicity in tragedies. You can't answer that now, but it makes you wonder, how often do mortals bear responsibility for dancing with gods, even when the music distorts their will? The chamber's torchlight flickers, revealing a fresco of Danae sealed in a bronze tower by her father, Acrisius, the prophecy being that her son would one day kill him. Yet Zeus transforms into golden rain, seeps through the cracks, and impregnates her. She emerges, cradling a miracle. Publicly, she's a passive vessel for fate's unfolding. But in private, did she feel invaded? Elated? Some say her gratitude shone like polished bronze. Others claim she lived in a haunted haze, half blessed, half burdened. Historians still argue whether Danae's story was originally a cautionary tale about royal paranoia or later reinterpreted as an allegory of divine favor. Your mind drifts again to Alcmene, who believed Zeus was her husband, Amphitryon, returning from battle. Zeus gifted her a night of 1,000 years, time stretched so long mortal senses blurred. She conceived Heracles in that one elongated embrace. When the real Amphitryon returned, Alcmene swore she spent the night with him, truthful from her perspective. Yet the child born was unmistakably divine. Here, consent becomes a sliver of light in a storm. Alcmene thought she was giving herself to the man she loved. But the partner in her bed was a god. It's a story that feels equal parts romance and tragedy. Historians still argue whether Alcmene's experience was ever seen as consensual or simply a cosmic deception, and whether the Greeks, hearing this tale around hearth fires, saw it as miraculous or unsettling. Some fringe commentators even suggest Heracles' labors, his exile, his snake-choked cradle, stem from his uncertain parentage, the world's way of punishing him for a mortal mother's acquiescence to a god's ruse. You close your eyes and feel the brushstroke of an unseen breeze, as though a lover might move behind you. You tense for a moment. Imagine any mortal in such a haze of confusion. In the hush, you hear the lyre again, now singing a soft lament. It's Apollo's voice, lamenting perhaps a lost love like Daphne, whose transformation into a laurel tree was her only escape from his relentless pursuit. That transformation was her consent at last. Resignation over choice. Sometimes nature becomes refuge when the only alternative is erosion of self. Here's a mainstream truth. Greek myth frequently equates divine seduction with destiny, as if mortals had no choice but to be swept along. Only a rare few, like Atalanta, who resisted suitors until tricked by golden apples, attempted to claim autonomy over love. But even she eventually wavered. Scholars still argue how much autonomy was possible for mortals in a cosmos where gods controlled weather, shapes, and fates. You lean forward, letting your fingertips graze the cushion. You think of Semele, mother of Dionysus, who demanded Zeus reveal himself in full divine glory as proof of his love. He did, and she perished in the blinding light. Was this a cautionary tale about human hubris or a codependent tango where mortal desire merged with divine destructive power? Flyers in Delphi no longer advertise "Meet Zeus," but back then, mortals signed up for that blind date at their own peril. In the corner, a small statue of Aeolus, keeper of winds, stands watch. He's neutral, keeper, not predator. But even he cannot halt a zephyr sent by Zeus to sweep a mortal off her feet. You almost laugh at the irony. Aeolus tames winds for sailors, yet he's powerless to protect mortals from the storm of divine desire. You settle back, exhaling a long breath. Amid these stories, there are glimpses of resistance. Medea rejects Zeus's seduction. She falls for Jason of her own accord. Yet she pays for her choices with exile and infamy. Ariadne helps Theseus, only to be abandoned by him on Naxos. Their agency is high price. Perhaps the Greeks saw consent as a luxury mortals couldn't afford. Gods, after all, were capricious. Yet even gods faced boundaries. Hera, when disguised as Argive cow, was tricked by Zeus into consummation. She later charged mortal hunters for drawing her picture. Divinity both flexible and brittle, just like mortal flesh. You let these echoes drift through you. In this chamber, where murals of gods exploit smile down, you feel the weight of each divine touch, each mortal surrender. Lips that believed they kissed a husband, arms that embraced a bull, bodies that opened to golden rain, every tale a question of agency. As the torch gutters low, you realize this: consent in myth is a mirror to power. It's not about yes or no. It's about the gulf between immortal want and mortal will. And in that gap, stories unfurl. You rise, footsteps echoing on polished marble, heading toward a hallway lit by flickering sconces. Somewhere ahead, a soft voice recites an oracle, perhaps foretelling a mortal's choice, perhaps dictating a hero's doom. You pause, knowing that in this world, fate and desire dance in intricate duet. You step into the hall and let the torchlight fade behind you. Once a mortal asked a god for love. The god transformed. The mortal became legend. And somewhere, in the hushed aftermath, the question lingers. Who truly chose? You slip through a corridor lined with flickering torches, each flame casting the walls in bronze and gold. The echo of your steps is soft, intimate, as though the palace itself is leaning in to hear your heartbeat. Ahead, you see a raised dais bathed in gentle lamplight, an impromptu gallery where mortals have tried to capture divine chaos in brushstrokes and marble. Welcome to the art of swans, stripes of naked flesh, and strategic nudity, where every curve and swan feather carries centuries of meaning. You step onto a polished floor flecked with mosaic fragments, tiny tesserae that once formed elaborate scenes of gods at play, heroes at war, and yes, swans at work. You pause before a massive painting draped in velvet curtains. The image flickers in the torchlight like a half-remembered dream, Leda and the Swan. There, painted by a master of the Renaissance, is Leda reclining on a bed of silk, her limbs folded like a flower opening. The swan, Zeus's chosen form, presses against her with the gravity of 100 whispered promises. Every stroke of the painter's brush seems to hum. This encounter is beautiful, tragic, taboo, and irresistible all at once. You run a fingertip through the air, tracing Leda's marble-white skin, the artist's gold highlights catching your vision. It's a mainstream historical fact that Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo both sketched versions of Leda and the Swan, though none of Michelangelo's survived intact. Their fascination speaks of how deeply Renaissance masters were drawn to classical myth, an attempt to reconcile divine transgression with human beauty. Scholars still argue whether those sketches celebrated sensuality or critiqued divine overreach masked as pastoral romance. Beyond that painting, you drift past statues carved from Carrara marble. One depicts Venus emerging from a swan, a strange mirror to Venus's own birth from sea foam. Another shows Daphne mid-transformation, her fingertips sprouting leaves. The stone is cool under your palm, as if the subjects might breathe if you press a little harder. You recall how painters and sculptors often cloaked nudity in myth, legitimizing skin-bearing as an artistic virtue rather than mere provocation. Before long, you find yourself standing before a peculiarly small but striking fresco lined with gold leaf. Zeus as Swan, embraced by Leda, the title whispers. The swan's neck is arched like a question. Leda's expression hovers between ecstasy and confusion, a silent interrogation of her own participation. A quirky tidbit drifts into your mind. In 16th century France, an entire set of tapestries known as the Galerie de Leda was commissioned by the Duke of Nevers, each panel depicting a different stage of the myth, from Zeus's approach in swan form to the hatching of eggs. The original goal wasn't merely decoration but a conversation piece, inviting guests at the Duke's chateau to debate the morality of gods in human lives while sipping lavender wine. Historians still argue whether those tapestries were meant to celebrate the fusion of divine and mortal or to mock the pretensions of courtesy courts that reveled in scandalous storytelling. The gallery's hush deepens as you approach a display of woodcuts, black and white images where artists wield bold lines to capture stark contrasts, innocence and corruption, whiteness of feathers and redness of skin. One woodcut shows Leda's arms bent awkwardly as the swan's wings envelop her, a moment frozen between poetry and panic. You focus on the jagged shading around her knees, as if the artist wanted to hint at the hidden thorns beneath every seduction. A soft chuckle escapes. You think of Pan's Grove where leaves danced under his pipes. Here, leaves remain still, silent witnesses to a divine drama that artists could only approximate. You step to a tapestry that hangs near an open window, the cool night breeze slipping in like a secret. This piece, woven in the late Middle Ages, portrays Leda seated by a trough of water, holding 2 eggs, each speckled with promise. Nearby, her husband Tyndareus stands, sword at his side, expression unreadable. The tapestry's threads shimmer, gold for the swan's plumage, deep crimson for the satin drape that catches Leda's spine. You step closer, fingers brushing a stray thread. Centuries of dust and human breath gather here, and you feel a subtle connection, like tracing a palimpsest of mortal desire and immortal machinations. It's here that you recall how ancient vase painters often depicted Leda's story with minimal detail. Just a swan, a woman, and 2 eggs. Their black figure pottery showed Leda modestly clothed or half-naked, just enough to imply vulnerability without full exposure. That balance mattered. The Greeks understood how strategic nudity could be, an invitation to voyeurism or a shield for vulnerability. Historians still argue whether those vases were intended as erotic art for private consumption or as didactic objects illustrating moral lessons about hubris and divine whimsy. You glide onward to a small antechamber where the lamp's glow illuminates a modernist reinterpretation, splotches of white and gray, fragments of reclining form, and a single swan-shaped silhouette glancing upward. It's a 20th century artist's reimagining of Leda's moment, stripped of detail to convey trauma rather than romance. You brace yourself for a heartbeat, as if the canvas might shudder with Leda's unspoken fear. This version, hemmed in abstraction, suggests that myth isn't static, it reshapes itself based on the viewer's gaze. Here, swan and woman blur into an almost formless embrace, and you feel the weight of modern debates on power, exploitation, and identity. A gentle breeze stirs again, carrying the scent of jasmine mixed with museum polish. You drift to a bronze sculpture perched on a pedestal, a 19th century depiction of Apollo's pursuit of Daphne rendered in dramatic marble folds. Daphne's fingertips sprout into leaves, Apollo's sinewy form reaches still for a vanished love. The statue's base is emblazoned, flee or flourish. It resonates with the theme of transformation as refuge. You stand on tiptoe, craning for a closer look, and feel the cool chill of marble against your eyelids as you blink away tears, myth and artistry combining to blur the line between awe and sadness. The gallery's final room is dim, lit only by a single skylight where the moon pours in, silver and watchful. There, a modern installation beckons, a shallow pool of water, still as glass, with a single white swan floating at its center, a living echo of myth. For a moment, you forget where you stand. The gallery's walls dissolve, replaced by nighttime ripples and reed whispers. The swan rocks gently, its reflection a perfect double. You watch, breath hushed, as if any sound might break the fragile spell. Then you notice, at the water's edge, a single marble egg, half buried in sand and surrounded by petals of laurel. You kneel and trace its smooth curve, imagining Leda cradling something just like it. The moon's glow softens around you, casting gentle shadows that stretch toward the swan's reflection. It feels less like art and more like a living whisper, a reminder that stories are kept alive not by stone and canvas but by moments of quiet, shared wonder. You rise and step away from the water, letting the moon retreat behind a passing cloud. Without the glare of lamplight, the gallery dims, leaving only silhouettes of swan wings and human forms. You sense each piece of art holding its breath, waiting for another viewer to ignite the hush of myth in their own mind. As you drift toward the exit, you pass one last painting, Helen of Troy, draped in soft linen, holding the tip of a swan feather like a scepter. It feels as if she's gazing at you, acknowledging that every lover of art carries a piece of her story. She stands regal, haunted by her own image, beauty's burden and burden to beauty. You step through an archway into the cool night, where the palms whisper and the scent of wild mint drifts on a distant breeze. The gallery's door closes with a quiet finality, leaving behind a hush of paint, marble, and whispered lashes of feathers. You walk away under the stars, each step echoing like a drumbeat in a silent song. Swans glide on dreamscapes far below. Naked forms dance in your memory. And you, wrapped in the afterimage of art and myth, carry with you a curious calm, soothing, unsettling, and wonderfully human. You drift away from the hushed gallery and find yourself standing at the edge of a quietly churning river. Moonlight glints off the ripples, and you can almost hear the echo of endless myths wavering in the air. As you follow the riverbank upstream, you realize you're slipping into a less trodden corridor of Zeus's avian alter egos, stories so odd they seem like feathers scattered by a cosmic breeze. This is where you meet Zeus's other feathered flings, the stories that didn't quite fit in polite Olympus discourse but still swam through popular imagination. First, there's Ganymede, the Trojan youth so breathtakingly lovely that Zeus decided the best way to snatch him up was as an eagle. You watch a giant raptor-descended from god swoop down into a peaceful plain, eyes bright with divine hunger. He extends his talons, snags Ganymede's shoulder, and carries him aloft, straight to Olympus, where mortals don't usually get invited. Of course, most versions gloss over Ganymede's feelings, painting him as honored to be Zeus's cupbearer. You wonder if honored really captured the terror of being carried by a bird god into the sky's heart. Historians still argue whether Ganymede's story originally served as a metaphor for intercultural marriage alliances, "We'll lift your elite youth to our court," or if it was pure divine philander. The mainstream fact is that Ganymede became the cupbearer of the gods, a role of high prestige. The constellation Aquila, the eagle, commemorates him in the night sky. Scholars still debate whether Aquila was originally a local Thracian or Anatolian deity later absorbed into the Zeus mythos. Anecdotes suggest that pederastic relationships in ancient Greece might have influenced how this story was told. Yet whether Ganymede was a willing companion or a terrified child in desperate flight remains context-dependent, like a wind-whispered secret lost between closeted verses of Homer. As you follow the river further, you come across a glade where the grasses shimmer like rippling silk. Here, Zeus took the shape of a cuckoo to seduce Aegina, a nymph standalone in beauty and fate. The story goes that Zeus, cloaked in storm clouds, finds Aegina alone, mourning her homeland. He transforms into a gentle cuckoo, feathers soft as dew, and lands in her lap. She lifts the bird to shelter it from rain, only to discover in her hands the form of the god, radiant and unbowed. Their union births Aeacus, future king of the island that still bears Aegina's name. This is a mainstream tale. Aeacus becomes one of Hades's 3 judges of the dead, a righteous arbiter, perhaps inspired by his mother's compassion for the cuckoo's plight. But there's a local fringe sing-song that insists the cuckoo wasn't just a disguise, it was a ritual token. Some believe birds in certain Greek islands were sacrificed each spring to honor Aegina's memory of Zeus's arrival. Scholars still argue whether these sacrifices were genuine cultic rites or poetic inventions to explain lost springtime festivals gone missing from archaeological records. You picture villagers in linen tunics at dawn, placing small white eggs at the foot of a shrine, hopeful the next cuckoo's song won't be a call for crows. A hush follows you even as you drift on, carrying the tide of feathers in your wake. You sense that Zeus's bird transformations have a pattern: seductive, deceptive, and occasionally diplomatic. Next, the river bends toward a grove where reedy marsh grasses crowd the water's edge. You creep closer, hearing the faint scratch of claws. Suddenly, a goose emerges, dipping into the shallows and glancing back with golden eyes that gleam with divine cunning. This tale is less familiar. Zeus as goose courting Nemesis, goddess of righteous wrath. She flees divine advances by transforming into a goose herself, only for Zeus to become a swan in hot pursuit. One version insists they flew together across the skies until children hatched from their downy union, the twins Dioscuri, who are sometimes conflated with Castor and Pollux. Historians still argue whether this goose and swan origin for the twin heroes was an archaic pre-Homeric myth or a local festival legend wrested into elitist epic. The curious thing here is that goose and swan both belong to the same waterfowl family, Anatidae, yet the metamorphoses feel symbolic, like a discrete code of power dynamics in bird form. The goose may be gentle, but the swan is regal. Nemesis escapes Zeus's seduction only to be cornered by his persistence. You wonder if this was ever performed as an actual mask play during Dionysian festivals, with villagers donning bird masks, reenacting divine chases. Maybe feathers scattered across the stage hint at ancient theatrical traditions now lost to time. You edge further, and the glade shifts, hemmed by pillars of rock carved with half-erased reliefs. Here lies perhaps Zeus's most bizarre bird romance, with a mortal princess named Phaenessa. In this version, Zeus becomes a plump quail, puffed out with divine air, waddling across a hillside strewn with wild thyme. Phaenessa, drawn by the quail's gentle coo, picks it up, and in that moment Zeus morphs back into his majestic form, pressing his shimmer against her palms. Their union brings forth Tantalus, a figure cursed to eternal hunger and thirst in the underworld. As a quirky tidbit, some say Tantalus was so named because he was tantalizing, that his birth was an ancient joke, a warning that divine favor can sour into endless punishment. Scholars still argue whether Tantalus's eternal torment story originated as a moral lesson passed down through family cults of Phrygia or if it evolved from Mycenaean burial practices emphasizing violations of sacred guest-host laws. You shake off the sticky thought of Tantalus's fruitless grasping for the river's water, then notice the moon has shifted. The night's halfway point arrives, and you've barely begun to scratch the surface of Zeus's bird-bound misadventures. On the far bank, where reeds give way to pines, a familiar shape floats. The majestic white swan again, this time not for Leda but for Nemesis, slipping from one story into another like a leitmotif on a lyre. The overlapping myths blur. You sense that storytellers over the centuries stitched these tales together, fraying at the edges like a tattered tapestry. As you climb a small rise, you find a stone altar battered by wind and time. Scattered around it are carvings of birds, swans, eagles, geese, even quails and cuckoos. You trace a finger over a rough outline of a goose, feeling the chipped relief under your skin. It's possible this altar was a local sanctuary to the bird god, a cultic site where villagers left scraps of bread, grains, or feathers in hopes of divine attention. Historians still argue whether such altars served as commemorations of mythic romances or were places to petition Zeus to send gentle rains, beckoning his form as a nurturing bird. You lean your forehead on the cool stone, catching your reflection in a puddle that quivers when you breathe. The still water mirrors your face and a half-seen swan wing. It's as if the past and present swirl together, reflections entangled. Zeus, you realize, didn't just use birds for romance. He used them for narrative leverage. Each transformation offered a new angle on power, seduction, even divine legitimacy. In one final gasp of mythic wind, you remember a story of Thespius' daughters, 50 princesses each seduced by Zeus as a sacred quail, impregnated overnight. The next morning, each awoke to find a child of Zeus in her arms. That tale drops crowds of half-god children across Boeotia, a supernatural population boom courtesy of bird-bodied Zeus. Historians still argue whether this myth sought to explain local hero cults or was just an excuse to normalize mass divine impregnation as a characteristic sign of Zeus's liberal generosity. Tonight, you step away from the altar, dusting off your hands the weight of half-remembered names, Theanessa, Nemesis, Aegina, drifting in your mind like fallen feathers. You notice that the river, ever patient, continues its flow, as if unimpressed by divine chases and mortal woes. The water gurgles over pebbles, indifferent to whether swans or eagles skim its surface. You look back once, and in the fading moonlight, you swear you see a flash of white, Zeus's swan form slipping beyond the pines, gliding toward his next quiet romp on earth. Maybe he's seeking another sleeping heart beneath jasmine vines, or perhaps he's just a bird at rest, tired of endless schemes. You sigh, feeling your eyelids grow heavy. Each bird story, each glint of gold or gleam of feather, has left a whisper in your chest, a remembrance of how divine and mortal can entwine, like swans in mating dance, or eagles asserting dominance over plains of wheat. As you drift away, the crumbling relief of birds seems to murmur in farewell. The moon dips behind clouds. The river's hush becomes a lullaby. And you, carried by currents of myth, stumble toward sleep, wonder trailing behind like the soft rustle of wings. You drift from the moonlit riverbank and find yourself in a different kind of gallery, one where screens glow instead of torchlight and clicks echo louder than chisel strikes. Here, Zeus's swan antics aren't carved in marble or painted in oil. They're pixelated, looped, and remixed into modern culture. This is where the ancient myth meets today's meme machine. You settle into a well-worn couch, remote in hand, as videos autoplay in a soft cascade. First up, a short animated loop of a swan gliding across a pond, then suddenly morphing into a thunderbolt-wielding Zeus. A caption flashes, "When Bay hits different." You grin, surprised at how perfectly this absurd transformation translates into a millennial joke about unpredictable partners. It's the same story, divine deception, mortal surprise, but sped up, trimmed to 15 seconds, and set to a beat that's half electronic, half classical crossover. This is a mainstream cultural fact. Myths have always evolved to fit contemporary tastes. The Leda and the Swan story, once whispered in temples and sung by bards, now finds new life in social media. Scholars still argue whether these digital retellings honor or trivialize the original. Some claim memes democratize myth, making it accessible. Others insist they reduce complex narratives to cheap punchlines. You click on another clip, a mashup of Renaissance paintings of Leda and the Swan, each image crossfade until swans become scantily clad figures whispering staged conversations in modern slang. "You make me feel like I'm flying," says the Swan. "Don't get clucky," replies Leda. It's playful but also edgy, hinting at forbidden romance with a wink. A fringe tidbit bubbles up. A university in Florida once hosted a symposium titled Zeus Memes, Divine Copyright or Public Domain? Professors argued whether using classical imagery in memes infringed on intellectual property or simply continued a millennia-old oral tradition of myth retelling. Historians still debate whether such gatherings preserve cultural heritage or mock sacred texts. You lean forward, remembering how Renaissance artists used Leda's image to explore beauty, power, and violation. Now, a teenager halfway across the globe repurposes it to crack a joke about bad Tinder dates. It's a wild leap across time and sensibility. Next, you find a Tumblr post, a collage of modern celebrities photoshopped into scenes from classic paintings. Brad Pitt as a swan, Angelina Jolie as Leda, eggs glowing with LED filters. The post's caption, "When Hollywood Meets Olympus." You chuckle and think about how swans once symbolized purity and grace. Now they're just clickbait bait, an excuse to combine pop culture icons with ancient deities. Down the feed, someone has created a TikTok challenge. Dress like Leda, pose like the Swan. Users wear white feathered boas and flowy dresses, replicating poses by dipping heads and arching necks. The background track? A lo-fi remix of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. You watch a loop of a girl practicing her best mystical stare into the camera, feathers fluttering as she tilts her head. It's oddly mesmerizing and deeply irreverent. A mainstream historian once wrote, "The digital age has become the grandest amphitheater where gods and mortals alike parade their versions of myth, often without context." You feel that truth in your chest as you scroll. This isn't just a joke, it's a transformation of culture. The swan's metaphor for divine seduction morphs into a symbol of unpredictable relationships in a swipe-right world. You click on a short Vine compilation titled, "Zeus's Worst Swans Ever." It's a rapid-fire sequence of clips. A swan hissed at by a dog, a swan flapping into a kayak, a swan chasing a man on a bike, each labeled with captions like, "When you're the god of the sky but can't park right." It's hilarious and ridiculous, but in the back of your mind, you feel a pang. This creature once symbolized poetry, now it's a punchline for viral content. Scrolling further, you stumble on a fan-made subreddit dedicated to Zeus, the god of disguises. Threads dissect every animal transformation: bull, eagle, shower of gold, swan. Users rate each form on a scale of creep factor, romantic potential, and would you swipe right? Someone comments, "Swan 10 out of 10 for drama, but scaly king cobra 11 out of 10 for scare factor." You shake your head at the casual cruelty but also can't stop laughing. A scholarly debate note breezes in. Critics argue that turning sacred myths into memes erodes reverence, while others see it as a vital living conversation about power, identity, and gender. You remember how the original myth flirts with consent issues, Leda's agency minimized, Zeus's divine prerogative prioritized. In these memes, those nuances are long gone, replaced by punchlines about dating woes. Is that a betrayal of the moral weight or a natural evolution of storytelling? You scroll past a collage of eccentric humor, a cracked egg emoji next to a swan silhouette overlaid with text, "When your ex ghosts you, but it's more dramatic." You nearly choke on a laugh, modern heartbreak distilled in an ancient metaphor. You pause on a digital painting showing Helen of Troy emerging from a cracked smartphone screen instead of an egg, her beauty so intense it causes pixelated ships to sink in mockery. The artist's caption, "Loading? Shall we start another war?" It's clever, blending ancient causes of conflict with modern rage quitting. You think about Helen's face that launched 1,000 ships. Today, it could just as easily launch 1,000 hashtags. You press play on a short clip titled, "The Swan Squad Assemble." It's a CGI recreation of swans marching like a Greek phalanx, each wearing a tiny golden helmet. The background track is a parody of epic battle music with rubber duck trombones. You can't help but laugh, but in the back of your mind, you recall how swans once accompanied Apollo's chariot, symbolizing harmony. Now, they march into absurdity, a cosmic joke on divine drama. A fringe community uses these memes to discuss deeper issues. Some feminist groups reclaim Leda's story to critique power dynamics, posting art of Leda holding her fractured eggs as a symbol of fractured autonomy. They write captions like, "When the system breaks you, you still hatch your own destiny." Historians still argue whether these modern reinterpretations honor Leda's silent resilience or co-opt her narrative for contemporary causes. You close your eyes, feeling the pace slow. Modern memes scroll past in your mind's eye, each a tiny spark of ancient myth reimagined. You wonder whether, centuries from now, someone will scroll through digital archives, seeing these memes as curiosities, a window into how humans wrestled with consent, power, and humor. One last meme flashes before you, a minimalist silhouette of a swan with the words, "Be your own god." A simple swipe of a caption that feels equal parts empowering and absurd. You chuckle, thinking about Zeus's tendency to swoop in, claim mortals' lives, and rewrite destinies. Here, someone says, "No, I claim my own destiny." It's a quiet rebellion, tucked inside a laughing emoji. You drift to sleep on that thought, how the loudest, most chaotic myths can become the softest lullabies in digital form. The swan that once carried Zeus's seduction now carries a multitude of voices, jokers, critics, survivors, each looping the myth into something new. In your dreams, swans with headphones dance across glassy screens, feathers rustling like swipe notifications. You dream of a Leda who picks up those eggs and paints them with neon colors, symbols of stories reclaimed. You see Helen, stepping out of a phone as a coded warning to look beyond surface-level allure. You see Castor and Pollux, drifting across digital starfields as emotes in group chats, symbols of brotherhood and sacrifice. And as you drift deeper into the soft embrace of sleep, you know this. Myths aren't static. They don't just rest in dusty scrolls. They live in every swipe, every laugh, every digital sparkle, flickering like a star reborn in algorithmic night. So while Zeus's swan may never roam the earth again, it swims through polyphonic feeds, reminding each viewer that even the wildest divine play can be distilled into a single, shimmering moment of shared wonder or shared hilarity. The glow of screens fades, replaced by the pale lamplight of a study lined with books that seem heavier than they look, leather-bound volumes crackling with possibility. You step into this quiet sanctuary of words, where Leda's story has been retold in ink, paper, and digital files, stretching across centuries. Here, the swan's echo becomes a whisper in poetry, prose, and scholarly debates that ripple outward from bedroom lamps into academic journals and living room sofas alike. You run your fingers along the spines until you find a slim volume of William Butler Yeats's sonnets. You settle into a velvet armchair and open to Leda and the Swan, feeling the weight of Yeats's meter before you even read the words. His lines ripple with urgency. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still. Above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed. By the dark webs, mild hands, by the loose tide. He captures Leda in mid-transformation. No eggs yet, just the shock of divine violence rendered in fevered iambs. You lean forward, caught by the tension. Yeats wrote this in 1923, driven by the aftermath of World War I, when Europe reeled from bloodshed that felt as inevitable as a god's desire. A mainstream literary fact is that Yeats's poem sparked decades of analysis. Some readers hail it as a stunning modernist meditation on violence and power, others decry it as romanticizing rape. Scholars still argue whether Yeats intended to condemn the abduction or to explore history's cyclical nature, as hinted in his closing question. Did she put on his knowledge with his power slash before the indifferent beak could let her drop? A fringe tidbit. Rumor has it that Yeats's draft originally referred explicitly to Helen, but he removed her name to universalize the act of violent awakening. Whether true or not, it shapes how readers see the poem, as both a testament to personal trauma and a symbol of historical upheaval. You close the volume and imagine Leda's eyes, wide with forced encounter, transformed into Yeats's powerful metaphor for colonial conquest, for history's pendulum swings, for individual violation. You drift across the room to a modern anthology of feminist reinterpretations. Here, Leda's story mutates into a vehicle for women's voices refusing to remain silent. One essay reframes the encounter as a lens on bodily autonomy. Instead of passive victim, Leda becomes the narrator grappling with the aftermath. "I woke in fragments," she says, "no longer sure who I was beneath golden feathers." This version treads intentionally on the margins of myth, spotlighting Leda's interior life. Feminist critics still argue whether reimagining Leda as a survivor rather than a poetic symbol offers a powerful corrective to millennia of male-authored narratives, or whether it imposes modern sensibilities on an ancient text. Next, you find a journal article that traces Leda's presence in Shakespeare's circle. Though he never wrote a Leda play, references swirl. In Troilus and Cressida, Helen is a looming ghost of desire, and the Swan metaphor pops up in Elizabethan sonnets as shorthand for illicit passion. A mainstream historical fact. Renaissance dramatists and poets often used classical myths for moral exempla, cautionary tales woven into courtly entertainment. In Shakespeare's day, educated audiences would catch allusions to Leda's tale, hearing the faint echo of eggs that birthed war and heartbreak. Scholars still argue whether these nods to Leda in Elizabethan poetry reflect genuine engagement with Greek sources or simply the Baroque fondness for exotic classical allusion. As you turn the pages, you stumble into a small shelf of mid-20th century novels where Leda reappears disguised. One protagonist conjures Leda's dilemma when she resists a powerful boss's advances, recalling the swan's weight on her bosom as an image of unwanted authority. The author offers a quirky tidbit. She once admitted in an interview that she first heard the myth from her grandmother, who hinted at Leda's trauma with a single line, "Be wary of gifts that look like swans." That familial retelling, passed down in hushed tones, became the seed for a novel exploring workplace power dynamics. Scholars still argue whether such contemporary retellings honor the myth's spirit or dilute its cultural specificity. You rise and walk to a corner where a slender paperback rests, Margaret Atwood's short story, Flight. Though Leda isn't named explicitly, lines about feathers and flight hint at her. Atwood uses the swan as allegory for the predator-prey dynamic in human relationships, painting a scene where a woman unknowingly shelters a bird that becomes a destructive force in her home. You feel a chill as Atwood's prose reframes Leda's myth into a quiet domestic horror, power cloaked in beauty, agency stolen in soft gestures. You recall that Atwood's work often engages feminist reinterpretation, and here she leans into the unsettling intimacy of consent violated. Historians still argue whether such allegories reinforce or subvert the original myth's intentions, but the resonance is undeniable. You recognize that every generation reframes Leda to explore its own anxieties. Leaving Atwood's story behind, you cross to a soaring shelf of contemporary poetry. A pamphlet catches your eye, Leda's Eggs, by a Greek-American poet. She scatters short lyrics as if they're bird droppings, elliptical, startling, each line a kernel of loss. I bruise with white light, and wake in porcelain shards, to question lineage. The poems meditate on heritage, motherhood, and the silence that follows violation. One poem ends with a gesture toward technology. They say I live in binary H0101 in a cradle of code. It draws a direct line from ancient eggs to digital eggs, avatars that carry identity into a new realm. You sense that this poet channels Leda's narrative to explore diaspora, how smashing in one era can reverberate through countless lives. Scholars still debate whether diaspora readings of Leda's myth extract too much contemporary politics or uncover latent angles in the ancient text. A solitary volume closes with a gentle thud in the quiet room. You notice the tall shelves start to blur as your eyes grow heavy from pages and possibilities. But you aren't done yet. One final text beckons from a glass-topped display. A Star Wars analog novel from 1980 titled The Swans of Naboo. It's a quirky homage. A powerful Jedi prince transforms into a swan-like creature to win the heart of a princess on a water world. The parallels to Leda are unmistakable, though the novel uses the transformation to celebrate mutual consent. No eggs, just star cruisers. It's pop culture myth-making at its most playful. A fringe fact: legend says that George Lucas's team studied Leda's myth while developing the Swans of Naboo subplot, though official sources remain silent. Scholars still argue whether such pop culture retellings trivialize myth or keep it alive in new contexts, but they undeniably stick in your mind as a testament to how far Leda's echo reaches. You lean back, letting these words and images settle like feathers drifting on a breeze. Each iteration of Leda's story, Yeats's furious sonnet, Atwood's intimate horror, modern poems, pop culture homages, spins a new thread in a tapestry that spans millennia. No single version captures her fully. Instead, each reveals different facets of power, violence, beauty, and resilience. You linger on one final reflection. When Leda's eggs hatched, they raised children who shaped legends, Helen triggering war, Castor and Pollux bridging life and death, Clytemnestra forging her own path of vengeance. In literature, Leda's own offspring are these retellings, stories that rise from her fractured body and scatter seeds in every culture and medium. She lives in every reimagining, sometimes as a victim, sometimes as a woman reclaiming her voice, always as a locus of questions about agency and desire. In the hush of the study, you close the last book and breathe deeply. The scent of aged pages and digital ghosts mingles, a melding of old and new. You rise, stretching limbs warm with narrative electricity. You reach for the door, pausing to let the quiet steep fully in. Outside, the world hums softly, the pulse of traffic, distant voices, the half-forgotten whisper of a swan's wing. You step into the hallway, carrying Leda's many faces in your mind. She is the swan, the egg, the poem, the feminist retelling, the pop culture wink. She is every woman who has ever grappled with power she didn't choose, and every artist who dared to give her a voice. The study door closes. You walk on, knowing Leda's afterlife in literature is far from over. Each new reader, each fresh pen, will light another spark. And you, drifting through books and screens, are part of her enduring flight. Dawn breaks gently over marble columns and olive groves as you drift toward the last echo of this journey. A space where myth, metaphor, and the quietly unsettling image of a god in swan form linger like a final note in an unfinished song. You find yourself in a courtyard draped with climbing vines, their leaves brushed silver by the early light. Somewhere offstage, a swan coos, soft, persistent, impossible to ignore. It's as if the very air still hangs heavy with Zeus's final presence, reminding you that, in the end, myths refuse to vanish completely. You step onto a mosaic floor depicting a swan's graceful neck arcing toward a woman's outstretched hand. Though worn and chipped, the image resonates with mythic gravity, the moment before the plunge, the moment where mortal and divine meet in an embrace neither can fully claim. Historians still argue whether this particular mosaic was a decorative piece for a wealthy patron or part of a temple sanctuary dedicated to Leda's offspring. Either way, you feel the weight of centuries pressing at your ankles. A mainstream fact enfolds you here. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of mosaics and frescoes illustrating Leda and the swan across the Mediterranean, from Sicily to Anatolia, suggesting this myth held broad appeal. It wasn't just a Greek story. It was a shared one, echoing across cultures that revered the swan as symbol of poetry, prophecy, and sometimes seductive peril. Scholars still debate whether these artistic renditions were commissioned by elites to assert divine favor or by common folk seeking protective amulets against unpredictable power. At the courtyard's edge, you pause under a laurel tree, its leaves whispering overhead as if recalling Daphne's transformation. In the canopy, a lone swan feather drifts down and settles at your feet. You lift it gently, noting the soft barbs that feel both delicate and resilient. It is both a token of beauty and a reminder of force. You remember how Apollo crowned victors with laurel wreaths and how Daphne's bark became sacred to him. That same tree, you realize, holds multiple myths entwined in its branches: defiance, pursuit, transformation, and grief. Near the marble bench under that laurel, you see a small cluster of wild flowers, white lilies and purple violets, woven together as if placed in offering. No inscription tells you who left them or why, but you suspect they honor Leda, symbolizing both purity and the bruised underside of myth. A fringe tale claims villagers in this region once gathered at dawn to lay blossoms at any shrine resembling swan imagery, believing it would ward off unwanted journeys or divine seduction. Scholars still argue whether these floral offerings were genuine folk practices or later romantic inventions by poets seeking to tinge the myth with pastoral nostalgia. You settle onto the bench, the feather tucked between your fingers, and let your thoughts drift through the layers of story that have unfolded. You think of Leda's eggs, hatching children who shaped legend and war. You think of Zeus's countless disguises: bull, golden rain, eagle, quail, and how each form carried echoes of divine whimsy and mortal upheaval. You reflect on how art and literature seized on these moments, from Renaissance canvases draped in skin and silk, to Yeats's fierce sonnet, to feminist reframings that handed Leda a voice at last. Each retelling peeled away layers until the core remained, the tension between power and vulnerability. In the courtyard's hush, you sense the swan, a silhouette gliding across a reflective pool in one corner, its white form mirrored in rippling water. You watch as it bows its head, neck curved in both elegance and question, as if asking, who truly held choice? Who truly bore consequence? You rub your thumb over the feather's barbs, feeling the fine down, and wonder how many hands have touched this myth's seams before yours. It feels less like ownership than stewardship, an invitation to carry forward these echoes. You rise and wander deeper, passing weathered pillars inscribed with faint glyphs. One reads, Mu O Sigma Tau Nu Lambda Theta Epsilon Iota Alpha. To me, there is truth. It's ambiguous. Truth of myth? Truth of power? Or truth of human frailty? You whisper the words under your breath, feeling their resonance in the cool morning air. Above you, two swans circle a turquoise sky, beating wings in a silent duet. Their flight seems eternal, unaffected by mortal bounds. In that moment, the boundaries between myth and reality blur. You sense that this story never truly ends. It migrates, transforms, nestles into new hearts and minds like a wandering feather. You close your eyes and inhale the scent of laurel and wildflowers. Your chest swells with a quiet gratitude for Leda's haunted courage, for Helen's incendiary beauty, for the twins' loyalty, for the artists who gave shape to tragedy and tenderness. You think of every scholar and poet who argued over meaning, every painter who brushed a swan's curve, every poet who penned Leda's anguish. In the hush, you feel their collective heartbeat, an echo as persistent as a swan's call. You step away from the mosaic, leaving the feather behind as a silent offering. The swan's reflection in the water follows you, a gentle presence guiding your steps. As you walk, the courtyard recedes, and you sense the wider world stirring. Villagers tending olive groves, early traders loading amphorae, shepherds calling sheep to pasture. The myth remains here, waiting in shadows and lilies, eager to be discovered again. Your journey with Zeus's swan has carried you through chrysalises of story, from ancient Sparta to digital screens, from marble mosaics to modern verse. Each step revealed that myths aren't locked in stone. They live in every brushstroke, every whispered poem, every scrolling feed. They follow you like wings, stirring the air behind your back. You pause at the courtyard's gate, looking back as morning light bathes the stones. The swan is gone, but you know it lingers in memory. You murmur a closing thought. Maybe the true power of myth lies in its ability to carry both beauty and burden, wrapped together in a single set of wings. You step into the new day, the echo of feathers fading behind you, but the resonance of the story humming within. Swans may glide away, but their imprint, divine, demanding, deeply human, remains in every heart that dares to listen. Soft silver dawn floats across olive-tipped hills, and your body eases into the gentlest of rhythms. Each breath becomes a ripple, echoing the swan's final glide across moonlit pools. Picture Lita's courtyard one last time, petals drifting on water, mosaic stones glowing pale. Let the memory of that swan's quiet coo fade beneath a cradle of morning birdsong. Feel your heartbeat settle into a tender hush. In this space between wakefulness and sleep, recall the mosaic floor beneath your feet, the feathers' soft barbs, the whisper of laurel leaves overhead. Every image melds into a single sense of calm, a gathering of mythic echoes that settle like gentle mist across your mind. Let go of any lingering tension, those mottled wings of thought rustling in your chest. Release each worry like a feather drifting to the ground. In its place, allow a hush of wonder, Lita's courage, Helen's radiant ache, the twins' celestial bond, and the swan's whisper as it vanished into dawn. Imagine yourself floating on water, weightless as myth itself, carried by currents of soft light and memory. History's heavy scroll unfurls into a lullaby, voices once loud become murmurs of comfort. Each note reminds you that stories hold power, yet they can also soothe, wrapping you in the quiet embrace of a world where gods and mortals meet in fleeting moments of grace. As you drift deeper, know that these echoes remain within you, a gentle hum beneath your heart. Tonight, may your dreams be feathered, soft swans gliding on glassy lakes, laurel leaves rustling in gentle winds, marble mosaics unfolding like secret maps. Sleep now, in the hush of first light, and let the swan's lesson carry you into a world where transformation and release live side by side. Sweet dreams, beloved traveler.